And
Cool.
Jeff will be on as well.
I'm here.
You just got on.
Oh, you're here. Oh, okay. I can't see you.
You know,
Let me see. There you go. Oh, goodness.
this camera, I know. I figured for all my Northwest relations, I better just let them know we still love them.
Is it Slacker Friday or? Oh,
It is. We actually have a charity thing here. If you want to wear a jersey.
I am recording, so this can be captured for later. So I'm Matt Rantanen, Director of Technology for Southern California Tribal Chairmans and partnering in business development for Arcadian Infracom. And we're hosting this webinar today for ATNI, Affiliated Tribes of the Northwest Indians, on the 2.5 gigahertz tribal priority window. And with me is Jeff Blackwell and Irene Flannery. Go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Go
Jeff.
ahead.
Oh, Irene, go ahead.
Oh, me. Hi, this is Irene Flannery. I am the Director of Ameren Critical Infrastructure. And I am a former FCCer, spent 14 years at the FCC, 5 of those as Deputy Chief of the Office of Native Affairs and Policy. So we're very happy to be part of this webinar. We are one of the entities, we're cooperating with a number of other entities, but we are one of the entities that is providing our services pro bono to help tribes and tribal entities apply for the tribal priority window. So thanks very much to ATNI for including us in this webinar. Very happy to be a part of it.
Jay Chukma. My name is Jeff Blackwell. I work as the Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel for Ameren Risk Management. Like Irene, I too am a former office chief at the Federal Communications Commission. I worked on 2 occasions in the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. Early in the millennia, I worked when the Bureau was young and growing on intergovernmental issues. I was the liaison to tribal governments. And then in 2010, I returned to the commission after working for Chickasaw Nation Industries in between 2 stints. I worked as the office chief of the Office of Native Affairs and Policy. I think I've spent probably somewhere around 12 years in total at the FCC. This time on the outside of government, I am involved in intertribal government associations as well. Matt and I actually co-chair the Technology and Telecommunications Subcommittee of the National Congress of American Indians and have the pleasure and honor of working very closely with tribal leaders nationwide. I also have the honor of chairing the parent committee to our subcommittee, the Community Finance and Economic Development Committee. So 2.5 is a unique opportunity. We're very fortunate. I look at the list of panelists. We're very fortunate to have a representative from the FCC on the line. Oh, and I see an old friend, Danae Wilson, just logged on. But recognize a number of names. This is really an opportunity. We've worked together. So here at Ameren, we have Ameren Critical Infrastructure that Irene is the director of. So 2 former FCCers, 2 former federal regulators here. We've been working with Matt and Southern California Tribal Chairmen and the Google American Indian Network to prepare the materials that we have for you. And these are available to you. You know, that we want to spread these. They're not proprietary. We want to spread them out primarily because without a change in the policy, we're well within a 2-month deadline at the Federal Communications Commission to file these applications. And our major thrust today will be getting the application in place. Although we recognize there's a lot of talent in the Northwest, and like Matt, there are a number of tribal technology leaders that have built tribally owned and operated networks in the Northwest as well. So back to you, Matt.
Well, I just wanted to say our host, Danae Wilson, is here from ATNI. Hi, Danae. And I did post the link to the presentation that I will be loading up in the chat. So.
Oh, I think I was probably remiss for my friends from the Northwest who are Mariners fans. I just decided I'd make you feel comfortable. It's unfortunate we're not playing these days, but we'll see you again soon.
Danae, did you want to say anything before I load the deck?
Sure. I apologize for being late. It's our biannual general council meeting, so our membership meetings. And I was listening to our law and order report and just lost track of time. So I apologize for being late, and I came right back over to the office.
I just totally assumed that somebody plugged in the coffee pot late.
I left got my jug with me.
I would love to trade Bragnar colors with you as well. I look like a very senior elected official right now with this orange complexion.
It's the orange tan that gives you away. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my share the presentation for folks, and we can start walking through this information. So give me a second. There we go. Share. Now, is everybody seeing a presentation?
Yes, can see it. Can see it really good. Thanks.
Cool. All right. So this is the document that Google American Indian Network folks, Suzanne DePoe, Chris Easton, and Amron, both Jeff and Irene and myself have put together to aid tribes in a general understanding on the 2.5 gigahertz tribal priority. And hang on, I gotta click on that to get, there we go.
I was saying, Matt, can I interrupt you one quick second? We're asking,
Sure.
we've got a chat asking for the link to be posted one more time.
Okay, hang on. I can't see the chat again. So if you can scroll up in the chat and copy and paste again.
Yep, I will. You
Awesome.
can go ahead and I'll get that taken care of.
Yeah, the chat disappears when I present for some reason. Oh, wait, maybe do it. No, I can pull it. There we go. Barbara did it, or no, there it is. You see it? Copy, paste, there.
There it is. Great, thank you.
Yep. Let's see. So this is the agenda that we'll be following in rough order. We do have an addendum to this. At the end, you will see a bunch of really geeky materials. That's there for your nighttime reading or, you know, brain racking reading. But for those that understand networking and some of those components, it's there for your viewing. We aren't going to cover that today, and we will be glossing over a couple of these slides since you have access to this and focusing on the details of just applying for the window itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about networks and spectrum. For those of you on the call that may not know about this, you know, it's a valuable piece of the puzzle to solve your connectivity issues in Indian country. For instance, Red Spectrum in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Tribal Digital Village Network in Southern California, Yurok and Karuk tribes in Northern California. These are all tribes that have used spectrum to solve connectivity to support their tribal communities and their tribal lands. And the spectrum that we're talking about today is 2.5 gigahertz. And it is a very nice piece of spectrum because it is going to still go to auction after we are done with this tribal priority window. So they haven't restricted its power usage. And it actually is a fully functional band of spectrum where if you have unlicensed spectrum that's available to the general public to use, the engineering office at the FCC has reduced the power abilities of the public space spectrum so it doesn't interfere too much with each other. And that has made it less useful to doing the things that we need to do with it to connect our communities. So this is a chunk of spectrum that allows you to connect homes, tribal buildings, municipalities, and it has the right power you would need to build out a network. We are going to I'm just trying to see, hang on a second. Jeff, step in at any point with this, because I think you and I can talk about the value of this, and then I'm going to get to the specifics with Irene.
So a little bit more background on this 2.5, and I think there's a lot of information. Obviously, the window's been open for a good long time. And I think, and there are multiple organizations that have been involved in the space, including one that I'm sure a number of ATNI tribes are familiar with, MuralNet. So what we're beginning to learn is that there's folks are in very different places in terms of their understanding of what 2.5 gigahertz is, what the opportunities are, how it should be, sort of a broad view of how it can be used. I think a couple of basics about 2.5 gigahertz. When Matt says that it's good spectrum, so these channels were originally allocated during the John F. Kennedy administration for over-the-air television for educational entities, for universities and colleges. And so if you're as old as I am and you remember over-the-air television, you remember the difference between what black and white TV was and what color TV was, that it could come in Technicolor and could carry stereophonic sound, and how powerful it was. Well, that's because of the qualities of these types of frequencies. So while it isn't necessarily beachfront property, it is certainly better than the kinds of stuff that people are routinely familiar with, like your old phones at home that were wireless, or the stuff that you use for baby monitors or garage door openers. And for a long time, a majority of tribal networks in the United States were operating in unlicensed spectrum. So they were having to put up with an amount of interference. So when it comes to building a network, there will be options with these, depending on your specific situation and whether or not there's spectrum available. We have to get into that. But there are options for building networks. There are also other options that we'll get to that we want to make sure you're aware of, because not every tribe wants to build a network. Sometimes they want to be the landlord to that network. And it's very important to think about spectrum as being part of the digital divide puzzle. The other thing that I want to reiterate and make sure people understand is that it is the FCC's duty to see this spectrum utilized. So if a tribe does not assert their cyber sovereignty in this environment and go to the FCC and get the licenses with this tribal priority window, it will be auctioned, and there will be an entity that typically they're, corporate entities or venture capitalist entities that will purchase the license and then own even more spectrum over your reservation. So,
yeah. So the simplicity, and we have a couple of diagrams coming up too, the simplicity of building a network that supports this tribal priority license will display in a next slide, but it can be a real easy thing to build a network that supports your community, and it can be an extremely complicated thing once that takes a life of its own and grows. And the message that we want to get across is that the build out requirement is simple, and we'll show that later, and that shouldn't be a fearful or a thing that you would be afraid of in the long run, because there is a long run up to your first commitment and timing. And we have a lot of help in Indian country to be able to pull this off. So you need access to the spectrum before you can build this. So that is what we are focusing on today. Hang on, I got to advance. There we go.
Wait, Matt, will you go back to that previous slide? There's a sentence here at the bottom of the second paragraph. Networks can be fully administered by a tribe or owned and leased to a third party. So there's large chunks of this spectrum in the United States that that have been subleased to Sprint Corporation. And now Sprint, T-Mobile, they're very interested in obtaining these licenses from the FCC. So to the extent that there is a method by which a tribe would be able to comply with those build-out requirements by working with an existing carrier and subleasing the spectrum for build-out. I think it's very important that people also think about spectrum and these spectrum licenses as assets. It is not just the platform upon which to build a network or have a network be built, but also there are resources at NAFOA and a webinar not unlike this one that focus largely on how a license at the FCC is a bankable asset and is leverageable not just to build a network, but also leverageable in terms of the overall assets that are owned by a tribe. So back to you. Thanks.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you know, controlling the sovereignty of your spectrum is an interesting concept in Indian country. I mean, I believe there are the majority of tribes would like to have access to all the airwaves over the reservation. And obviously that's not the way the United States has structured this resource. But this is the first opportunity that has come across that allows you to take a portion of that and maintain control of it. You can maintain control of it by using it to build a network, but you can also maintain control of it by leveraging other companies to build with it for you. So that's what we're trying to get across in this today. And the application due on August 3rd is the step into that. And here is a basic thing that you would draw on a piece of paper to understand what you were trying to do. You would have a distribution point. You would connect to the key things on your reservation. Now there's a link there that's a blue line, that's a straight line between the two towers. That is a point-to-point link. And that point-to-point link is required at the 2-year mark to be able to serve community populations up to 50,000 people. That's the checkbox. If you miss that, you move, and we'll have this later in the slide, but if you miss that, then it pushes out to 4 years instead of 5, or pushes back to 4 years instead of 5 to build out your final requirement. But most of the populations of tribes, there are some single interesting ways to fulfill that requirement, to connect two entities serving your tribal community, to get the basics out of the way while you're deciding how to deploy a wireless network to your schools, your tribal governments, your health services, your emergency services, and your housing. It gives you a timeline that is very doable to be able to support your community in this process. And in the instance of, like the Tribal Digital Village or Red Spectrum, where we have used the unlicensed spectrum space that is available to us from the FCC, and we have used some licensed point-to-point links because we have used all the unlicensed stuff. This is another tool in the toolbox that opens up opportunity for you to grow your network and expand. So networks can eventually look like this, and you want it to look like this if you're running an internet service provider business and you are managing multiple entities, and you probably have a fee-based service to serve your community, or you have some sort of subsidy that supports that. And it does end up getting complicated. But if you take a real look at this map, it's not as complicated as all the arrows seem. It is much more seamless than that looks. But we want you to eventually, if you're going to take on a networking perspective, we want you to eventually understand that you can grow into a service provider that provides this for lots of people. So act now. August 3rd is the deadline. And, this is it. This is valuable spectrum, and it's going to the highest bidder. And this is the first tribal priority window in broadband.
Matt, I want to make sure that when we get to the point about complying with build-out requirements, that we can flip back to slide 6 as well, because there's some important information to sort of cross-reference between those two.
Very sure.
Yeah, so these are some of the key benefits. I mean, 20 years ago, many tribes did not understand the interrelationship between a majority of their governmental priorities and the touchstone issue of telecom services and broadband. So now, particularly in the environment that we're all in with COVID-19, there's never been such a press for information around how to improve broadband at home and on the res. So this slide is just a smattering, just touches on the kinds of things that the kind of missions internally to tribes right now that are being stressed by this situation, by a lack of telecommunications in general, but in particular, high-speed broadband internet.
So let's see. The qualifying details are the fun part, and this is why we bring Irene along, because she is much more organized than I. So I will have Irene take over the process of.
By the way, Matt, I didn't know we had any childhood pictures of you. That was an amazing bonnet you were wearing back in the day.
Of who? Hang on, sorry.
Matt, you need to go back.
Yeah,
There we go.
I was trying. I was trying to go back, but it was fighting me.
For those who don't recognize Matt, he's the boy in the middle of the picture. His head is now big enough to fit into that entire bonnet.
I think that bonnet fits as a patch on my chest now. Okay, go ahead, Irene.
Okay, so we will, a few slides forward, we will get into figuring out how you determine whether there is available spectrum over your land. So that's something that we'll cover. That of course is critically important, because if there isn't spectrum available over your land, then these requirements really aren't all that important. But assuming that there is spectrum available over your land, the FCC has established 4 eligibility criteria for this tribal priority window. As Matt and Jeff had described, the typical way that the FCC licenses spectrum or allocates spectrum is through an auction. And during those auctions, the highest bidder wins. But in this instance, the FCC has opened this special window, the tribal priority window, where only eligible tribes and eligible tribal entities are able to apply in advance of an auction. Whatever is left over, as Matt had said, whatever is not allocated and licensed during the tribal priority window will then go to auction, and providers will come in and pay a lot of money for this spectrum. So there are 4 requirements. You have to be an eligible tribal entity. It has to be eligible tribal land. Your tribal land has to be located in a rural area, and you have to establish that you have local presence on your tribal land. So starting first with the eligible tribal entities requirement. As you can see in this slide, that includes, and this is the FCC's definition of tribal lands, any federally recognized tribe or Alaska Native village is eligible, or any consortium that includes federally recognized tribes and or Alaska Native villages. So that's the easiest qualification, is if you are a tribe, a federally recognized tribe or Alaska Native village. But tribal entities are also eligible to apply during the window. And in order to qualify as a tribal entity, you have to be both majority owned and controlled by a federally recognized tribe or an Alaska Native village. Again, just to repeat that, it's both majority ownership and majority control. And then as part of the application process, there is an eligibility exhibit that is attached to the application. It's an all online process. And so the tribal entity has to provide documentation to establish that there is that tribal ownership and control in order to comply with this requirement. The FCC has explicitly said in this context that an eligible tribe or tribal entity does not include Alaska regional corporations or other entities that are owned by tribal members as individuals. Alaska Native villages are eligible, but the regional corporations are not. All right, next slide, Matt. So that's eligibility criteria number 1. Number 2 is eligible tribal lands. So essentially, going back to the definition of an eligible tribe, it's a federally recognized tribes. Again, this comes straight from the FCC's rules. A federally recognized tribes, reservation, pueblo, or colony. A former reservation in Oklahoma. It's a bit of a misnomer, but that's what's included in the FCC's definition. An Alaska Native region that was established pursuant to ANCSA. An Indian allotment. Hawaiian homelands are also eligible, and Hawaiian homelands were designated and created pursuant to the Hawaiian Home Commission Act. And then this final category is off-reservation lands if they were designated by the FCC as tribal land as of July July 10th, 2019. Where this comes from is within the FCC's Universal Service Lifeline rules, where a process was created so that a tribe could come to the commission and ask for additional land that didn't fit within these other categories of the definition to be considered tribal lands for purposes of the Lifeline program, which is the Universal Service Subsidy program for low-income households. The reality is that this process has been in place, has been available for a number of years, but only a couple of tribes have taken advantage of that process. And the FCC closed that opportunity as of July 10th, 2019.
Apologize. Did I jump 2 slides or 1?
No, that's fine. The next one, so it's an
Yep.
eligible tribal entity, eligible tribal land. Qualification number 3 is rural. So the FCC has imposed the requirement for the tribal priority window that it not just be tribal lands, federally recognized tribal lands in Alaska Native villages. They have to be tribal lands that are located in rural areas. All of the land for which you're applying has to fit within the FCC's definition of rural. So the definition in the 3rd bullet there is rural tribal lands are tribal lands that are not part of an urbanized area with a population of 50,000 or more. So as part of the application process, the FCC has created shape files for every eligible tribal land. If you use the FCC's shape file, then that is prima facie, or essentially you're deemed to meet this requirement if you use the FCC's shape file. The only qualification to that is if that shape file contains any urbanized area with a population of over 50,000, then you still have to demonstrate that rural nature. If you choose to use your own shape file, which is fine, you don't have to use the unmodified FCC shape file, but then you just have to provide more information in your eligibility exhibit to establish that all of the area fits within the FCC's rural definition. Okay, so on to requirement number 4, local presence. Now, there's been, the language is a little conflicting in the FCC's procedures public notice. They released a public notice explaining what the procedures would be to apply during the tribal priority window. So on the one hand, if the applicant is a tribe, you're presumed to have a local presence on your own land. But the FCC is still asking for some additional information to demonstrate that, in fact, you do have that local presence. So they want an explanation at least a high level that you as the tribe physically occupy your lands, that you have tribal members, you have residents living on your land, and that you provide goods and services over or on your tribal land. So just providing a bit of additional information. What we're recommending is that you make the statement that if it is the tribe that is applying, and you cite what the FCC has said in their procedures public notice, that the tribe is presumed to have local presence, but then in an abundance of caution, you provide a little additional information as to the fact that you do actually physically occupy your land, and provide at least a little bit of information on the fact that you provide goods or services on your land. Hang on, Matt.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. In Alaska, the rules are just a little bit different, but local presence outside of the ANCSA area can be established by showing a community connection to your lands. And again, if your going to the last bullet there, if you are, for example, if it's a consortium and you're applying for licenses over multiple tribal lands, you do have to establish that local presence on each of the individual tribal lands. Okay, I think we're done with that slide. Did you want me to take the overlay license, or would one of you gentlemen like to take that?
Well, I think we just ought to
like
reiterate.
Jeff's cup of tea.
Yeah, no, I think we ought to just reiterate that there's an eligible tribal entity requirement. It's the tribe, a consortium of tribes, or an entity majority owned or controlled. There's an eligible tribal lands requirement, and then there is that eligible tribal lands excludes the more densely populated parts of tribal lands. So it's rural tribal lands that are not part of an urbanized area with a population of 50,000 or more. And then there's this local presence requirement. And the local presence requirement is really, I mean, what Irene just went through is very important for folks to be able to, we're not necessarily as tribal governments used to going back and re-explaining why we are where we are and why the land that we're on and inhabit is land that is held in trust for us and how it derives from that. But not to overthink that, it is sometimes you can think of it as a little bit of restating the obvious, but also teaching, you know, being able to tell a story and teaching the FCC and telling the story to the FCC about your historical, cultural, legal connection to the land that you're applying for. And this is going to be important if in the context of any potential waivers to get filed. So yeah, to that next, this slide about overlay license. So there is a requirement, the ability of the FCC to license on what they call a tribal priority actually devolves directly from the Telecommunications Act. And it is a licensing mechanism that the FCC has used for over a decade. It started in the broadcast context for broadcast radio. And what Irene described earlier about there being highest bid wins auctions for spectrum, the FCC began licensing spectrum in the mid-90s. And so much of it over tribal lands was already licensed. And when the FCC had the opportunity to take a look at how to increase radio station ownership in the late, in around 2007, 2008, 2009, it looked at the potential of creating other mechanisms other than auctions. And the FCC does have authority to do what are essentially initial qualifications thresholds. So in this context, the initial qualification is that it be the federally recognized tribe that is responsible and has sovereign jurisdiction over and a contextual relationship to that land. You know, to the FCC's credit, to the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau's credit, this is the first time it's ever been done in this type of spectrum. But there have been a number of tribes who've been very successful in obtaining even full power commercial FM radio stations using a tribal priority licensing. And both Irene and I know for a fact that the FCC has been looking at 2.5 gigahertz as a potential for rural and tribal build out for the better part of, I mean, first started looking at about 8 years ago. So it's really good that this is now coming available, and it's very important for us to spread the word on it. So one of the things, however, that is a requirement under those threshold qualifications is something, are we essentially treating this as the mutual exclusivity, or are we talking about overlays associated with operation?
This is not the MX.
Okay, so this is very straightforward. When you first get it doesn't come initially as the license. It comes as if you're authorized for an exclusive license. Essentially, what you get from the FCC is a build out requirement, and you get an exclusive build out right. So the tribe, if there's another license holder in your land pardon me, let me move my screen here a little bit. In this situation, if there's another license holder in your land that cancel defaults on their license, there's the potential of that license defaulting to you. I hope everybody has had an opportunity to learn that what the FCC has is heat maps available on the existing licenses here, and we will get to a point where we can illustrate this. And in one of the, you can sort of see here on the side, this is a portion of New Mexico here in the visual in the lower right hand corner of this slide, not far from where Irene and I are sitting, involving some of the Pueblo lands west and south of Albuquerque. And that red area represents an existing license that, because it is red, there's not a current amount of spectrum available to a tribe, those tribes that have on their portion of those reservations. But if they were able to obtain and apply for and obtain the other portion of their reservation of that license, and then ultimately the other license holder either cancels, defaults, or even comes to an agreement with the tribe, that license, the tribe basically has pole position to be obtain that 2.5 gigahertz that would revert.
I think the illustration in the bottom right hand corner kind of talks about a little, visualizes a little bit of that piece.
And you'll see it in another slide that we have, but
yeah, let's migrate to that slide because it really is.
Here we go. So we were able to obtain, the use of this slide in coordination with Siston Wapton. For those who know folks from the North Plains, you're kind of familiar with. This is a reservation that kind of illustrates in the 3 separate channels that are available in this licensing proceeding what the folks at Lake Traverse have that's available. So Matt, I guess the 3 of us can take a shot at this. So in channel 1, if it's orange, there's some spectrum that's available. If it's yellow, there's more. If there's no coloration, it's wide open. If it's red, there's almost none available. So you can see in channel 1, the lower corner has more available than in the middle of the majority of the upper part of the triangular reservation. Channel 2, kind of the same amount for the entire reservation. Channel 3, the northern part of the reservation is pretty wide open, but from a centroid point of that license, the lower part of, there where you see Route 12, that's unavailable. Now, when it comes to Lake Traverse, their agency and a lot of their population is actually kind of in the center north of this reservation. Although they do have communities that they're considering building lower, they're very interested in getting as much as they can. So the recommendation is apply for all of it that's available.
Yeah, I was going to say, this picture shows you if you apply, you will get a good portion of channel 1 and a really good portion at the bottom of channel 1 or bottom of the reservation. You will get a pretty good portion of channel 2. You will get a great portion of channel 3 in the top half of the reservation. So combined, those portions of the 3 channels will allow you to do more with your network building and your opportunity with your network building. It will also allow you to do more as far as leveraging it as an asset for communications to be brought to you and or monetarily. But we are encouraging everybody to apply for all channel 1, channel 2, channel 3 availability over your reservation from one entity, because the opportunity is now, and that will go to auction. If you only apply for channel 1, channel 2 and 3 are going to go to auction.
Matt, just to add, the only time that you would not want to apply is if within a channel it's completely red.
Yes.
If it's completely red, that means that there is no spectrum available. But if only a portion of the channel is red, as Matt and Jeff have both said, apply for whatever is available in every channel, in channel 1, 2, and 3.
If you want to see what that looks like, come down to San Diego, look around the map in San Diego, and most of our reservations are all red, where there is no channel available at all.
Actually, Matt, before we go on to waivers, I know you're technically gifted. could we drop out of the PowerPoint and actually bring up the map of the Northwest United States? Because
In what program? Or in the FCC window?
yeah, it makes this portion of the presentation so much more relevant to folks, particularly folks in any country that are so, you know, have a really good sense of the map of other reservations and folks in their region.
Let me try that. Hold on. I just need to get to a new window.
The unfortunate news, while Matt's bringing that up, is that when it comes to the spectrum immediately around places like Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia, parts of you know, some of the major population densities in Oregon, like Salem, over closer to places like in Eastern Washington. What's the town I'm thinking of? We always have the right there next to Coeur d'Alene. It's oh, I can't remember the name of it all of a sudden. Sorry, but there's still. Oh, is the map up yet?
I'm pulling it. Hang on.
Yeah, there are still whole reservations that have not filed applications that, looking at all 3 channels, are wide open. So when it comes to folks on the western side of the peninsula.
Okay, so where do you want to look? Here, let me share screen.
Yeah.
Hang on.
I'm sure that this is a screen that folks like Danae, who chair the ATNI telecom committee, telecom utilities, who co-chair that, look at.
Are you looking at my screen now?
You got to show view entire map.
Okay. Come on, button.
And then take us up to the northwest. You can just click in.
Something like that.
Spokane, yeah, and then turn on channel 1, channel 2, and channel 3.
Wow, that was interesting. I was expecting other circles to show up, and they just got darker.
Yeah, they don't get terribly darker.
So in other words, in Spokane, you don't have any channels.
Spokane, but for instance, like I don't know if anybody's on the webinar from Umatilla. So Umatilla, you know, south and east of Yakima, you down a little bit from where your cursor is, right there. If you turn off channel 1, channel 2, channel 3.
So 3 is unavailable, but 2 is available.
Well, and then unclick 2 if you just want to see 1.
Yeah.
So 1 is wide open.
It looks like channel 1's wide open.
Yeah. Yep. And channel 2 is a partial, and channel 3 is used.
So those of us, I mean, the community of folks who work on telecommunications for the intertribals, you know, Danae, Crystal Hottaway, a number of people who've been you know, in the ATNI region, there are a number of folks, you know, the Susie Allens and Valerie Fasthorse. They're very familiar with this, but I think a lot of other folks haven't necessarily taken full advantage of the quick and dirty views that these maps provide. This is a rarity. You know, typically the FCC can make, and I can say this as a former FCC guy, because there were times where I made things more complex. Sometimes these processes at the commission can be very complex, but this 2.5 gigahertz situation, this proceeding is relatively, you know, it's relatively streamlined and straightforward and available, and dare I say, pretty easy. But it's just like any other line. You got to get into it to get out of it, and now's the time to start acting. So if you go over to the western side of the Olympic Peninsula, where Quileute and Ho and others, Quinault, what we're all hoping and assuming is that folks are in progress we like, I think everybody else has kind of heard that there's a bit of a backlog out there and just processing applications with some of the folks who are doing these pro bonos or helping tribes kind of visualize and conceptualize what, or design the networks on top of this. But I'm just going to say flatly, here we are on June 19th, on Juneteenth, and it is very important. Quality is job one. Get the license. There will be time. We are aware that there are certain situations where the application came hand in hand with the design of a network, and that conceptualization might have slowed things down in certain areas. I did, for those who were on the call earlier that led to this webinar, I was asked to do a presentation by Terry to the ATNI tribal leaders, and there were multiple tribal leaders who said, well, we don't have the spectrum. And not to throw Ron Allen under the bus, but Ron said, we don't have spectrum. And I said, Ron, you do. I'm looking at it right now. I have all 3 channels turned on, and I think there's spectrum available in that area. But we would have to, of course, dial into the specifics. But just looking at this map, and it looks like there's a large number of the ATNI tribes. You know, there are a significant number that, of course, do not have the spectrum available in 2.5 gigahertz, and we're all just going to have to help them try to find other options to get access to spectrum.
I'll tell you what, it looks a little better than California. Watch this.
Well, it looks a little better than Oklahoma as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also important to drill down channel by channel. So
Yeah,
when you click all 3, it's the combined kind of the worst case scenario. So one channel that has none could make it look like there is no spectrum available. So drilling down channel by channel it depends on, depends on the region, may give you a little better picture, because there may be, as we looked with Sisseton and Wahpeton, there was way more spectrum available in channels 1 and 2 than there was in 3, except 3 had the regions where it was, the part of the reservation where it was available was almost wide open, with then a smaller subsection that had no spectrum available.
Yeah, and to build a network, just so to relate this back to actually, what does it mean if I have all 3 channels or 1 channel or part of a couple channels? As I said before, this is a tool in the toolbox to build networking for your community. If you don't have all 3 channels and you only have a partial on 2 of the channels, or you have only 1 channel out of the 3, this is still a very valuable tool to do certain things with wireless networking, like moving bandwidth from where you receive it, maybe on fiber or your backhaul to the rest of the world, to a different portion of your community to deploy, or using this frequency to deploy in this neighborhood where some of your other technologies don't work because the power is too low. There are options even with slivers of the channels available. So I think the value is in the application and obtaining the opportunity to do something with it in the future. I mean, we do not want to set the precedent, obviously, of failing to utilize a license that we apply for. That's certainly not the business we're in. We're trying to show that tribes are interested in this space, that we would like to look at opportunities for more tribal priority in the future, because this is the way that we're going to solve our communications problems, because the incumbents are not solving our communications problems. And, setting a standard where, we are applying for licenses and using them properly and working within the confines of the restrictions of the license, we're willing to do that and make that work. But absolute worst case scenario is you forfeit your license back to the FCC if you don't meet out your requirements. Would you like to go back to the presentation, Jeff?
So I just would want to make the offer and want to make sure folks know there are a lot of organizations that are bringing a lot of skill pro bono to this world, and whether it's us, whether it's anybody else, we want to do all that we can to help people get moving in this, and get the tribes powered up and get them resources. I have heard from certain tribes. I got a call last week, actually earlier this week, from a tribe that had heard about one of the webinars, and they said, well, we're almost done retaining the attorneys to do this application for us. And I said, aren't you aware that there are a whole bunch of organizations that are doing this for free? I think the assumption is that there are a number of these that are going to be in progress and be filed. But however we can work with you, Terry, Danae, others on this call to help spread the word and just get people in progress to apply for the licenses. That's the whole point of this webinar. But yeah, it's time to, I think, return to our slide deck.
Okay, I'm attempting that now. It wants to be funky. Hang on. I have 3 monitors, so you know it's a shell game at this point.
A monitor shell game. Oh,
it really is.
That's a first world problem, Matt.
Hey, I'm sitting in the middle of the Paula Indian Reservation, so it is a tribal problem right now.
I thought you were on the Millennium Falcon, man.
Oh, well, that's my disguise. I'm a Wookiee. Okay. So where did I not? No, this is what we want here. Hang on. There we go.
There we go.
Present. All right. So we've seen that in live action now. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to talk about a waiver about, I don't know, that long, right, Irene?
Yes.
Okay.
Essentially, what is a waiver? So the FCC created the shapefiles and which defined what they consider to be the eligible tribal lands. If there is land outside of what those maps show, for example, land that has not yet been brought into trust, if you want to apply for a spectrum license over that land, you need to submit a waiver, a petition for waiver to the FCC. And basically what a waiver does is you come to the FCC and say, my circumstances are special and the rules shouldn't apply in my case. Now, I'll kind of caveat all of this with the most important thing right now is to file the application for the land that the FCC says over which you're eligible to apply for a spectrum license. So get that application in. If you want to pursue a waiver, that's fine. What would happen is that waiver, if you decide to move forward with that, once your application is in the system, before the window closes on August 3rd, that waiver petition would be filed and attached to your application. But you don't have to wait to file your application until you're ready to file, or until you've made that decision as to whether you want to file a petition for waiver.
That's right. We don't want you to miss the opportunity to at least capture the license where the FCC is identifying your lands. And if the lands that the FCC is identifying doesn't match your tribal maps, at least capture that license where it has been identified and then pursue the waiver component, because it takes a lot longer to do that. We'd rather have the application in the hopper ready to be reviewed prior to you working through the waiver component, because, you know, stranger things have happened like COVID-19 and you can't get that done, and then you don't have your application in for at least what land is already allocated.
Yeah,
right. That's particularly crucial as we're coming down. We have less than 60 days left.
Yeah.
So particularly, and COVID, you know, has had a tremendously bad impact, and that's why many entities went to the FCC and asked for the window to be extended, as the Commission has done with many other application processes and subsidy programs, but that hasn't happened. And so the assumption is the deadline is August 3rd. And as time is, you know, as time is getting shorter, getting that application in is critically important. And then if you want to file the waiver petition, again, as that slide had indicated, talk to an attorney. There are many of us doing this, as Jeff said, pro bono, where we can help you with the waiver petitions. It's the way the waiver process works is the FCC has a legal standard. They presume that their rules are right and proper. So that's where you start, because the FCC is going to say we have a rule and it should apply to everybody. But in the waiver petition, you have the opportunity to say to the FCC, but my circumstances are different and special, and you should grant me a waiver for that reason. So you're essentially taking the opportunity to paint a picture for the FCC, explaining to them what your circumstances are and why the rules don't fit in your case.
Jeff, can you unpack MX?
Actually, I want you to go back to the waiver for a little bit, because I want to buttress and add a little bit more to what both of you have said. So most certainly, let me put it in real simple terms. With the timing that you have left, that anybody has left, it is probably a good idea to go ahead and apply for what the FCC is ready and willing to give you. To the extent that you have off-reservation trust or fee that's not held in trust, or you have lands that have a historical context to where your people go and fish or rice, or you have a treaty right or usual or custom areas. Those are the kinds of complexities that the commission, if there's a request from a tribe, that the commission has signaled that it will deal with those through waivers. So the areas that are identified on the map that we just talked about, those are things that are available, and there's a presumption in the procedures public notice that those are the lands according to those tribes. That map, once you drill down into it, it's not just the urbanized parts of tribal lands that are excluded in this rural tribal window, but there are a number of things that tribes, I mean, at any given time, any given tribe has, their tribal lands are not a static thing. They're growing and changing and developing. You have plans going forward. We've been approached by a number of tribes with situations, for instance, like one that said, we have a large housing department that's held in a housing subdivision that's held in fee. We've been working getting it into trust, but it's not currently in trust. And it's within our former treaty area boundary. How are we going, what do we address on that? By the same token, there are questions out there about making with additional areas that have like a ridge close to a reservation with a higher terrain, being able to propagate the spectrum, to utilize the spectrum more efficiently, more effectively, kind of not necessarily a federal Indian law type of waiver, but a technical need waiver. The first thing in terms of these sorts of, if you're considering a waiver request, you need to get the folks who are experts in this area, and particularly those that are familiar with your own history, your law, your past, your tribal tenure, your land tenure. You need to get them involved, consult an attorney. Actually, there's such a growing discussion around waivers. We're looking to possibly hold a webinar just on waiver to help answer waiver questions, because timing is so short. It's probably better to consolidate those sorts of questions so that people hear the answers at the same time. But I want to reiterate, there's a lot that the FCC has been able to do for Indian country over the last 20 years in waivers. I think it is probably safe to say that the commission is not going to weigh in areas where there are, please don't consider this as being something like getting a technical waiver or getting an off reservation or an outside of these current boundaries waiver will support a land into trust application or something like that. But, we're always available to help put this in context. Irene and I both have a lot of experience with waivers, and not just the FCC's waiver standard, but the kind of things that work for tribes is, the perspective around what was happening. I have to tell you, there is a situation we've heard about where a tribe is very interested in much larger than what they currently have. That is hard to imagine without, a great waiver justification. So on the mutual exclusivity, this one's pretty simple. No two applicants can have spectrum over the same area. And if they do, the FCC is duty bound by the law and regulation to award the license through a competitive process. So it really behooves you to front load the communication. So if there are areas that are very close to each other, in not so many in the Northwest, but in other parts of Indian country, there are tribes that are right next to each other, and or that may have an interest in the same area. But if there are two applications filed for the same spectrum, what the FCC will do is it will not process those. It'll provide a settlement window of 90 days to let the parties work it out. The two tribes or tribal entities work it out. One way to work it out beforehand is to actually create a consortium. Don't have a lot of time to create a consortium though. During that settlement window, if there isn't a settlement, what the FCC will create I believe it's an auction that's limited only to those parties. Aren't I correct, Irene?
No.
Oh no, is this one?
No,
Oh,
it just goes to auction.
If
It goes back into the pot that
Yeah.
will be eligible for the auction of the remaining spectrum.
Okay, so it reverts back to the general pool.
Yeah, if you cannot be nice and play nice and work together, it's over.
Yeah. Okay, so that is that's it in a nutshell. Avoid mutual exclusivity. Don't get next.
And here's where we're giving general information to tribes that are big enough to have multiple entities that are eligible, is that, look, have one entity apply. If you have multiple channels or multiple portions of channels available, each entity can still use the license as you deem fit within the community, but one entity apply for it. And then like your utility authority can use it for some things, your tribal government can use it for other things, and your education or your tribal college can use it for other things. So as long as you're in concert on who applies and what the overall goals are for this, it should be no problem using it on the ground. So here are the general build out requirements. 2 years, you have to do a mobile or point-to-point service that serves 50% of your population. That fixed point-to-point service has to have 20 links per million, but most of our tribes are dealing with the 1 link per 50,000 or under. Navajo with roughly 135,000 on reservation all the time. That's probably scaled up since jobs have closed and people might have moved home during the COVID-19. They're going to have to solve, a bigger link distribution to be able to hit 1 link per 50,000, but certainly doable. And then at 5 years, that is 40 links per million or 1 link per 25,000, which also incorporates a lot of our tribes. So it's a really simple build out. If you fail to meet the 2-year mark, your 5-year duration reduces to 4 years and speeds that timeline up to meet the 5-year requirement. But again, as I said, there are many, many tribal organizations that are technically savvy, that can walk an IT person through a process, some of us even have funding to come share this information. I do know that MuralNet is setting up STAs as we speak. So those are temporary licenses that are used in this spectrum that are actually live on multiple reservations. There are other organizations doing the same for themselves. There are resources available. So the same group that you reach out to learn how to apply, I would say is the same group you reach out to try to identify who can help you with the physical aspects of this moving forward. So what to expect? This is the timeline. Everything in blue is what you need to focus on. Everything in blue is what you need to focus on, because if you don't focus on what's in blue, you don't get to move into the gray, right? So once you hit that first yellow dot on August 3rd and you haven't done all the things in blue, you're not going to be playing on the right side of the yellow dot. You're not going to be in the gray stuff where you get to plan your network and you get to look at network security and protocols and the fun stuff. You get to design things. You get to talk to your education department and find out what their needs are. You get to look at your law enforcement and find out what their needs are and design something that maybe could incorporate, everything that your whole community needs. Obviously 2.5 is a great tool, but if you have a fairly complex scenario and multiple entities, you might be needing more spectrum to do that. There is a whole unlicensed swath of spectrum to use. where you can integrate this into it. But focusing then on the blue, you have to find out if you have spectrum available on the map on the FCC. You have to identify and educate your tribal authority to be able to sign off on this. So your tribal leadership, coordinate competing claims. That's work with your entities. Do you have a tribal college that also wants to apply for this? Do you have a utility authority that wants to apply for this? Or is the tribal government going to be the sole entity applying? You know, you coordinate those. You have an authorized signatory that signs off on, you know, the documents that need to be put in, and then you apply. You get an FRN number. You submit Form 602, which identifies your ownership, that you are the, you know, the tribal entity. And I will say, and Irene said this before, is that it's much easier to apply if you are the tribal government than it is if you are a tribal college, 51% owned, because you have to show way less backup documentation to prove that the tribe is your 51% owner and operator. So the tribal government has the easiest path. And then, you know, create your shapefile from the FCC's map and then submit Form 601, which is online. If you search for a Form 601, you're going to get a document that's like 120 pages long. If you go through the process of applying online, they have scaled that down to what is needed for this application for tribes. So please don't be discouraged by things that you search in Google. Let's see. I think we are at a point. I just did all that.
If we could just, Matt, just a couple of quick things.
Sure.
Again, it's an entirely online process. That includes applying for the FRN. That's what the FCC, it's the FCC registration number. Anybody that does business with the FCC, whether you are a licensee or whether you're required, you receive subsidy dollars or have to pay in to the FCC, you have to have it. Basically, it's a tracking number. The 602, that's the ownership form for tribes that are applying, and it's not as complicated. It's not that complicated a form anyway, but for tribes applying, the FCC has said you basically fill out the basic contact information on the form. You don't have to fill out the attachment, which is more of the getting into, you know, what percentage of your entity, who owns what. You attach a list of your tribal council members or whatever your governing authority is, with basic contact information and address and their title. So the 602 is an easier process than for tribes applying during the tribal priority window. And the 601 is actually the application form. And again, as Matt said, it's completely online. The FCC isn't going to take paper applications. And the FCC has actually done a good job of, if you have all of your documentation ready to go, it's a pretty easy process. And they've created a step-by-step guide to help you through. But there are also many of us, as we've said, who are offering our services pro bono to help with this process, if you would like.
Yeah, I want to pull something out of the chat. We were talking, I was typing it at the same time, but August 3rd is the drop dead deadline for this to be submitted. It is not the day you should apply. Let me just rewind you to today, right now. This process should start as soon as you can get onto the computer to start, if you have your pieces together, to start this process now. Notoriously, things happen, right? So at the last hour, the 11th hour of application windows, systems crash. Too many people try to apply at once and the system won't respond. Heaven forbid some other technical snafu happens outside the control of everyone. So we advise people to start this process now. We have heard a varying range of timelines on it, how long it took me to do this. I have heard as little as 15 to 20 minutes, but they had every single document in hand. They had the tribal leader sitting next to them. They walked right through the process, done. And they accepted the FCC's map, as was, no waiver. I've heard somebody that is very technically knowledgeable apply for this that took them 2 weeks. Not because it took them 2 weeks to get through the application. It took them 2 weeks to go back to the chair, to get a signature, to write a letter, to write the support, to get the documents. They did it all kind of on the fly. They built the airplane after they took off. So it's better to kind of look through this, get kind of your ducks in a row and your signatory in hand with you, and then start the process, because it can take under an hour.
And Matt, on the next slide, where again, we've gone through before the eligibility, those 4 eligibility requirements, again, to be, you have to be an eligible tribal entity, eligible tribal land. It has to be rural, your land has to be rural, and you have to establish a local presence. That is what the FCC refers to, establishing all of those that you qualify under each of those criteria is contained in your eligibility exhibit. You can do 4 separate eligibility exhibits if you want, 1 for each criteria, or you can put it in a single document and just have a section for it. That's actually the more efficient way to do it, but it's easier to upload 1 document than to upload 4. But again, having all of this information compiled and ready to go, you go online and start to apply. The process is pretty easy.
So we've done that several times. I'm just going to go, okay, so here's resources. I'm going to leave this slide up, but I'm going to ask Danae if she wants to open the chat or open the ability for others to speak. I think we have about 9 participants. We've answered most of the questions in the chat between Danae, myself, and Jeff typing into the chat while we weren't talking, or at the same time. That's why I'm not talking well. But I think, you know, if there are any questions, let's ask those now. We have about, I think, 10 minutes left to address anything that hasn't been caught. Jeff has put up everybody's contact information. I put mine up. Danae put a couple of ours up throughout the chat. Please grab those. I don't know, Danae, if you can capture the chat. I know it's doable. You could maybe save the chat and email it to the participants.
Sure. So everybody's microphone is unmuted, so you are able to speak if you'd like to. If there's anybody that would like to say anything at this time.
Yeah, so you have the ability to unmute yourself. Some of you still on mute, but you have control now. David, did we answer all your questions? Because I know you had a few.
No, I was going to ask you. So I actually found out we have an FRN. We actually have a license of some sort with the our law enforcement.
Okay.
And there is an FRN. I'm trying to track down who applied for it and where it's at.
Oh, here, let me touch on that. You can have a second FRN, and to speed up the process, just apply for your second FRN. They can.
Yeah, it's actually advisable to do that because it helps you track and separate, and those will have different renewal requirements. Yeah, there's no.
Yeah.
Yep.
That bypass.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And anybody else? Barbara, thanks for posting those links in the chat.
No, Irene helped me with a couple, because if you go on the MuralNet, I started the application with the one that MuralNet has to help us fill out. One of the questions asked if you have any felonies. So it was really good to find out that with the tribal application, that part doesn't actually.
That's right.
Fit. That's another advantage of having the tribe apply, right?
Absolutely. And actually, an individual is not eligible. It has to be an eligible tribal entity that is controlled 51% by the tribal government. So there are a couple applications on the FCC that show as an individual has applied. And we've reached out to a couple of them to those tribes to make sure that the tribe is behind that application, or the tribe is also applying for a real application of that. So I think what happens is some people feel like, oh, my tribe's going to miss this, I better apply for them, which is not how this works.
So also, Gary asked if after submitting the waiver request by August 3rd deadline, the FCC discovers that the boundary request overlaps another area, can that be resolved for after August 3rd? Or
It'll go into the MX request. It should go into the mutual exclusive scenario for the 90-day window, and will have to be resolved there after the 3rd.
Are there any other questions? You know, we posted all of our contact information. I can help set up one-on-ones. There's a lot of resources available. Office of Native Affairs and Policy has been very helpful in getting questions answered. So whatever can be done, whatever help you need, if I don't have the answer, which I may not, our panelists have the answer, and there's a whole swath of resources outside of this group that have answers and can help.
So
So
there's a big network of us working together, trying to get
right.
tribes over that finish line. We just had a consolidation call on the message 2 days ago, and I think everybody's on board with, you know, what we're trying to do, and we're looking for those that are slipping through the cracks that are interested. Unfortunately, there are tribal communities that still are not having office hours and may not even be looking at this yet. So, you know, though we are fighting for an extension to this at the federal government, we do not see that happening yet. So please, 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 if you have neighbor tribes that you know are kind of off the radar and you know how to reach out and get them in touch and let them know about this opportunity, get them these resources. Now's the time.
So Matt, I wanted to make sure folks know it's very important what Danae just mentioned in terms of the resource at the FCC. I'd be remiss if I didn't. The office helped build. I placed the Office of Native Affairs and Policies office chief contact information, Matthew Duchesne, his direct telephone number, his email, and also the main number for ONAP. They have reached out in various parts of Indian country to try to get a feeling for how much help is needed, how much are still waiting to come in, and Danae's right, they're a wonderful resource. Also, we are coordinating with the FCC just to make sure that we've got the proper information in terms of whether or not it would go to the regular auction or private auction on the MX situation. So we can follow up with you on that, Danae, and on the applicants or the participants and get that out. There was a question that was asked earlier in the chat. Dave, did you get your answer to it? It was about an uncommon.
I think we're going to take it offline, Jeff. You can handle it here, but also there's a question that just hit. I can do that while we're doing. Answer yours, Jeff, and I'll see if I can answer this one. Dave, do you remember? It was the one about what type of network you wanted to be. Is that the one, Jeff?
Yeah, there was a question that Dave posted to the panel that was basically a question about whether or not to be if we wanted to be a carrier, what type of carrier and what types of services to provide. Obviously, that's something that's broader than this panel, or this time frame. But you know, to the question that just came in to all the panelists attendees. So for those three of us, for the four of us that are on this panel, including Danae as one of the moderators, there's virtually no part of this that we can't help you with. Irene and our team at Ameren is helping with applications. Matt is helping, I think, not to recharacterize, but while you're looking at this, Matt, while you're looking at your answer, Matt is helping out in some of the conceptualization of the applications and but helping people more understand the uses of the spectrum. We are helping people understand the pros, cons, values of waivers and the kind of information that one needs to sort of have to move into the environment. And then we're working directly with tribal governments and tribal attorneys, tribal applicants. It really works best if you take ownership of the application, file it on your own behalf, but we're willing to sit there and help you as you're doing that. So it's not, we're trying to help as much as we can, but in terms of the capacity that SCTCA has and Ameren has, we have capacity to help on virtually any issue we've spoken about. Gain is not here. Actually, the picture you're looking at, the lady whose pen is in her hand is Suzanne DePoe, an engineer at Gain, and they are bringing resources. Google American Indian Network is the group of American Indian employees that work for Google, and they're very interested in trying to help in any way they can. They are not, they don't have the legal background necessarily, but in terms of technical need, technical help, and just being hands on deck when bodies and minds are needed to help a tribe. So Irene, Matt, Danae, please add anything to that. I think this is the whole point of having this webinar, was to try to help bring resources in an environment where we see lots of applications available. We do expect that some of those are in progress, but we've heard that there are others that aren't, and we do need to get through COVID. We do need to get through these communications chains to get to the tribes to help them.
We have
I
2
just
minutes left,
wanna-
so Irene, go ahead and close out.
Yeah,
Sure.
I was just gonna say, let's wrap up and close out here.
Go ahead, Irene.
I just wanted to reiterate what Jeff was saying. If you have any questions, please consider us a resource. We're happy to do whatever we can to help. And as Danae said, if there are questions that for whatever reason we can't answer, we certainly can find the answers and help you find the resources. So look forward to hearing from folks.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for your time today, and I hope we at least opened, some resources for access to maybe getting across the line with this. Please share this information with those that didn't attend today. I know everybody's got a busy schedule and it's hard to sit on a Zoom for 90 minutes. So, we're all out here. If you want to talk networking, many of us have examples of networks that have been built. If you want to talk about process, or if you need help with the application, all of us are here to direct you to where that can be done easily. So thanks. Thanks, Danae.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for participating. Have a great weekend.
Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you guys for presenting. That was great.
Thanks a lot.